everybody does. Welcome to In This Corner, the podcast on Fight TV, episode 27. I think this is going to be a very entertaining and certainly, and most importantly, informative show. We'll get to our special guest in just a moment. I welcome my regulars, my co-hostess extraordinaireess, looking gorgeous as always, Amber Renee Dixon. How you doing, Am?
Good, thank you.
And there he is, writer, boxing historian extraordinaire, CompuBox counter, Lee Groves. And by the way, folks, a little bit later on, we will dissect and break down what's going to happen this weekend as AJ Anthony Joshua takes on Alexander Usyk for a plethora of the heavyweight championship belts. Of course, there's way too damn many, but that is another story. Charlie Burley and the Charlie Burley cam will be along a little bit later on for that. But right now, I want to welcome our special guest. And I've been covering these kinds of subjects probably longer than anybody doing sports media. I mean, back on my radio show in the 80s, I used to have John Lestini on, who at that time was, I think he was the head of the National Steroid Research Center. And I'd also have on, sometimes on the same show, Mackie Shilstone, who was a sports and conditioning guru. I love Mackie, haven't talked to him in some years. So our special guest, Victor Conte, is perfect for that because he'll bring us up to date from everything from them to now, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and then some. Of course, he is the Snack founder and chief executive, sports nutritionist. How you doing, Victor?
I'm doing good, Smitty. Thank you very much for having me.
Do you remember any of those names I mentioned there?
Oh, sure. In fact, Mackie Shilstone wrote a chapter for Margaret Goodman's book, about his philosophy of training boxers. And she gave me that probably 2010 or 11 when I first met Margaret. So, yeah, and of course, I remember all the elite boxers that he worked with over the years. Great trainer and nutritionist.
How do you describe yourself in what you do? You're self-taught in so many ways with this. I said sports nutritionist. How does Victor Conte describe Victor Conte?
I would describe myself as a project team leader. I work with individual athletes, and there's different trainers, there's different strength and conditioning coaches. It's a team that we put together for whatever that project is. So historically, that could have been a sprinter or that could be a boxer. But of course, they have their own trainers and other people in their camp. And oftentimes we bring entire camps here to the snack training facility. But I also can work with athletes at a distance where everything starts with a comprehensive blood workup. So we can take a look at the immunology and hematology and all the anabolic hormones and the biomarkers of overtraining and so on. That's kind of where we start, I describe it as if you were going to take a trip cross country, wouldn't it make sense to take a look at all the gauges that you have in front of you so you make sure that everything is in balance is what we're looking for. There too much of anything is just as bad as not enough. Water, is the most important of all nutrient. It'll drown you if you get too much. So we're not about mega doses of anything. We understand the concept, which we call the teeter-totter effect. As soon as you get too much of one thing, that reduces something else. So you got to be very careful to make sure that things are in balance. You've got the anabolic catabolic ratio. You've got, as an example, testosterone is anabolic and cortisol is catabolic. And as one goes up, the other goes down. This is the teeter-totter effect that I'm talking about. So we try to make sure that, first of all, that the immune system at the beginning of camp is as strong as we can get it, because we know that an intense training camp lowers your immune function. We see white blood cell counts drop. If normal is 7, we see sometimes with overtraining, they get down into the 2s. And then oftentimes what happens is they'll get sick. They'll catch a flu bug right before the fight. So it's very important. We bring the the gauges to the party, so to speak, where we've got the reference points, and you know, if you ask a head trainer in boxing, well, how do you know the guy's overtrained? You know, they've got a lot of experience, and they may know, you know, approximately, you know, what's going on. But we believe that you need the science, and you need the measurements, and you need a plan that peaks the fighter on fight night. And
So
not
how does
a lot of
one
times they overtrain.
how does one go from a bassist with Tower of Power to working with elite athletes? If you can, Reader's Digest version, take us through that journey and what led you in, you know, from the music industry. And by the way, in the music industry, folks, there's a lot of drugs being used as well from all the people that I know in it to what you've done with athletes. Take us through that journey, if you will.
You know, I don't know what that was, but you know, back in the 1980s, specifically 1984 is when I started BALCO, and I had been working with 25 athletes doing blood testing and supplying them with individualized supplementation programs. And in the San Francisco Examiner, which was the Sunday issue of the Chronicle at the time, they wrote a feature story called Getting Athletes in Tune. And that was the exact question. They said, talk about a career switch. How does a guy go from music to medicine? And I was 33 years old at the time. I'd been traveling all over the world. I'd made 17 albums that are still available, a lot of them online. And I had 3 kids in a row. And it became very difficult for me to kiss them goodbye and say, well, I'll see you in 5 months. I'm going on tour with Herbie Hancock, and you come back and they're a head taller, you know. So I realized it's time for me to accept this full responsibility as a father, and find a way to earn a living and to help raise my kids. And because it just wasn't fair for me to you know, be gone all the time, 10 months out of the year. So one of my cousins, roommates at USC, a guy named Jack Cameron, he had started a laboratory in Santa Barbara that was originally owned by Dr. Sayoun, who was the head of the Visine Eye Drops Corporation. And it was called an ICP, an inductively coupled plasma atomic emission spectrometer. And it could analyze biological fluids and tissues and do this in about a period of 2 minutes. So it really lowered the cost, and you could get far more data than doing it, you know, sequentially or one element at a time. So he knew that I was an athlete, a track athlete in college. And so he sent me some abstracts. Now this is right in the beginning, excuse me, when, you know, the IBM computers and clones just started coming around. And he helped me get tapped into the National Library of Medicine. And so I would do searches on zinc and testosterone and magnesium and muscle cramps and copper and connective tissue ligaments and tendons and so on. And then I hired a medical director named Brian Goldman, who was at Stanford, and he took me down there and he got me a library card, excuse me, at the Lane Medical Library. And so I used to go down there 60, 70 hours a week, and I would do these searches. You know, they had those old, your computer monitor, the IBM format was either amber, you know, characters, or green, and there was no graphics. So I would tap in, you know, with these keywords, and then I would get the references, and I would crawl around on my hands and knees, and then I would read all these articles. And so I became really a specialty in the area of athletic performance and mineral and trace element metabolism. So thereafter, and I don't, they call it Victor's knack, excuse me, they call it Victor's knack, but right away in 1985, the first athlete that I worked with was Alberto Salazar, who at that time was the world record holder in the marathon. He'd won the New York City Marathon 3 years in a row. And then shortly thereafter, I started working with, I was at a medical conference, and the coach for Matt Biondi, who was a swimmer who won whatever it was, 7 or 8 medals. He was the world's fastest swimmer at the time at UC Berkeley. And so, excuse me, one thing led to another, and pretty soon I had 250 NFL players. and I was working with people like John Elway, and I went to their training camp and tested the entire team in 97 and 98 and put them all on individualized nutrition programs. And of course, I'm sure my role was very small, but they just happened to win back-to-back Super Bowls those years.
Now,
And so
I want to ask you for the sake of time, because I was thinking about I was thinking about you when I was watching one of my favorite shows, the series Breaking Bad. Can you tell us, was there a moment in time where you went rogue, if you will, broke bad, went into the dark side, or is it not fair to say there was like really a moment? But I'd like to know, because it sounded like you went in this with the best of intentions. If you can quickly take us through what went rogue, what went bad.
You're exactly right. People think that BALCO Laboratories was a steroid lab, and it was not a steroid lab. From 1984 until 2000, for 16 years, I did not give any type of performance enhancing substances to anyone. I can't say that I didn't know that some of them, like the bad boys of track and field in 88, I had all the shot put, hammer, discus throwers. Of course, I knew they were doing stuff, but they weren't getting it from me. And so and these substances do in fact cause other mineral and trace element imbalances. So I was kind of helping them monitor liver function, kidney function. When you work with these athletes, you know their wives and you know their kids, and they become a part of your family. So they were already doing what they were doing by buying these substances out of trunks of cars in dark alleys behind gyms. And I had the ability, because I owned a clinical laboratory, to do these comprehensive blood workups and help them do so more safely if such a thing can be done. So, a lot of times more is not better. The dose that you should be using should be lower instead of higher, because you certainly have a life after sport. And so for 16 years, I did everything on the up and up. I met a guy, Patrick Arnold, at the Mr. Olympia in 1999, October of 1999, and he knew that I was working with all these world-class athletes. And he said, "Victor, I have this stuff," he called it. He said, "I have this stuff," which later, as many know, and if they followed the BALCO saga, was called the Clear. That was a name that I made up. We have the Clear and the Cream. But he said, "I have this stuff."
Which you think Barry Bonds, of course, used.
Well, we now know that he did, because
right.
Later, after the testing got implemented, Jeff Nowitzki came to Las Vegas, went to the Quest Diagnostic Labs, raided the place, took all the documents, which he didn't have a search warrant for, and got a hold of, he had a search warrant for 10, and they took the entire Major League Baseball, everybody's samples. So then after the fact, when they first tested in 2003, a survey, and then in 2004, maybe 2005 or something like that, they went and got his sample and then had it retested for THG, and they found it. So I had given probably somewhere between 6 and 10 times. I had given the Clear and the Cream came in a 3-week supply. We would do 3 weeks on and a week off. Probably 6 to 10 different supplies to Greg Anderson, and he was using stuff himself. And you have to understand that back then, because there was no testing, they could use testosterone, they could use Winstrol, they could use any drugs that they wanted to. And in terms of dosage and effect, what I was doing, which was circumventing the Olympic caliber testing, was kind of baby food. They had the ability to eat some steak if they chose to, so they really didn't need me. So did I do the blood testing, and did I help Barry Bonds, in terms of that? The answer is yes. But after a while, we became friends, and his father got cancer, and I tested his father and helped his father with various supplements and protein shakes, and his brother had a chemical dependency, and I helped him. And so after 3 years of me helping Barry, and of course he'd broken all these records, when I asked him to do that very high profile muscle and fitness article, he said, "Sure, I'd be happy to reciprocate and do something for you." And so he did. And then the IRS and Nowitzki tried to claim that this was a drugs for endorsement deal, and it was not. And if you at some point had the opportunity, in which I have these now, all of the 35,000 pages of the BALCO legal case, Barry said to them, listen, Victor was my friend. And he said, whether you understand this or not, sometimes friends do favors for friends, and the value is priceless. So it wasn't any sort of an arrangement or deal that we had. And so that's kind of how it was.
All right, Amber?
Well, since you bring up Jeff Nowitzki, I texted him this morning to let him know that we were talking to you today on the show. For our viewers who don't know who he is now working with the UFC and heads their department on ensuring that fighters are not using performance enhancing drugs. And gosh, he doesn't think that you deserve a seat at the table in denouncing PED use currently because of what you did in the past, and especially because of what happened in the past, its possible harmful effects on the bodies of the athletes that you worked with. Are you aware of anybody suffering bodily damage as a result of some of those banned substances?
No, the only person I can think of that has said this was the sprinter Kelly White, who said that when she took the clear that she developed acne and she developed big muscles and she missed a period. And of course, you know, as soon as that happened the first time out, we reduced the dosage and those issues went away. So understand that, as I talked about earlier, that too much is just as bad as not enough. I was very careful. Now, were these potentially very dangerous drugs like EPO and so on? The answer is yes, but you know, once again, back to the watching the gauges, and we know that at what point, say, the hematocrit or percentage of red blood cells to whole blood volume in cycling, they if you have a number higher than 50%, they set you down for health concerns. So I was always watching liver function, kidney function, cholesterol fractions, and all this for the purposes of safety. So I think, you know, I don't want to get into a combative situation here with Jeff Nowitzki. I've stated publicly, you know, a lot of what I think about him. And he did say that he felt at some point that I owed him a thank you for bringing me over to the right side. And I do, and I've said that publicly on Twitter, that I owe a big shout out and a thank you to him. So he's, I think he's very sensitive to some of the things that I have said, even recently, about the financial aspects of Jeff Nowitzki's arrangement with the UFC and Travis Teigart's arrangement. I wrote in an article recently that was on Sportico that I didn't think it was right that Travis Teigart suddenly increased his salary from, you know, to over $600,000 when the next highest paid person is $150,000. Why does he deserve to make 4 times more than everybody else there? And I'm sure it has something to do with the money that's coming from the USC.
Travis Teigart is with USADA, correct?
Travis Teigart's with USADA, and he doesn't like me either. And part of the reason is because I knew some things that he had done that I didn't approve of, such as, do you want me to tell you this story? Because it's, yes?
I mean, is it potentially libelous for us? Will we have a slander?
Whatever it is, I'm a truth speaker. So anyway, I decided to work directly with Dick Pound, who was the founding chairman of WADA. And I did work with USADA before he became the CEO. So Terry Madden was the CEO, and I met with him in 2003. And then I met with Rich Young, who is a co-author of the World Anti-Doping Code, who was there at USADA. But I met with him in February of 2005 and went over close to 3,000 pages of documents helping them, not in exchange for leniency. I accepted full consequences. I went to prison, do the crime, do the time, okay? But there was a situation involving Kelly White where he told her to do certain things and that he would mitigate her consequences. Instead of 2 years, that she's a world-class sprinter, won double gold at the World Championships in 2003. And she came to me initially and told me about this offer that Travis had made to her. And so I said, well, it's up to you, whether you want to cooperate or what you want to do, that's your choice. But she did. And so I think Travis basically wrote a speech for her. And then they traveled all around to the Copenhagen and New York and London and different places. And she got up and said what she was supposed to say. And then afterwards, when she said, well, okay, so now I can be reinstated and come back in 1 year instead of 2 years. And he said, oh, well, by the way, I forgot to tell you that the IAAF is going to demand that you pay back all $350,000 that you earn before you can set foot on the track. And she never got to come back. So he misled her, right? And this is what I don't like about Nowitzki as well, is law enforcement sometimes thinks that it's okay to lie, cheat, and steal to catch the bad guy. And there's a lot of things in Nowitzki's past. For example, I'll touch on one thing, okay? When they raided Greg Anderson's house and they found $63,000 in a shoebox above the microwave, and 4 IRS agents counted it, and then they transferred it to a bank, a Wells Fargo bank in Oakland, and then Nowitzki came and got it and took it first to his office in San Jose, and then the 4 IRS agents met at the Bank of America, where they put it into a safe deposit box. And somewhere along the line, after it was counted in Burlingame, counted again in Oakland, the third time they counted it, there was 6 $100 bills missing. So as a result, and for Nowitzki, who met with other not IRS agents, but San Mateo County Narcotics Task Force agents behind this Hyatt Regency Theater near BALCO, and he routinely was saying, I'm the modern day Elliot Ness. I'm going to take Victor Conte's the modern day Al Capone. I'm going to take everybody down. I'm going to cash in. I'm going to get book deals. I'm going to get movie deals. He's said all this stuff routinely, where they actually even went to the U.S. attorney complaining about Nowitzki. Now somebody also filed a report, and TIDCA did an internal investigation, and under oath, he admitted that he said every one of those things. And they never found this missing six $100 bills. So also under oath, they investigated and talked to the U.S. attorney, Jeff Nedrow, and they said, would this affect a trial and the credibility of these agents? And of course, he said absolutely that it would. So when I got a hold of this 150-page TIDCA report and realized at that point that I had the leverage, I basically dictated the terms and conditions of the 4 months that I went to prison, because they would have lacked credibility if they would have went to testify.
What was your sentence? I know you served 4 months.
I got a split sentence, which is it's a split sentence, 4 and 4. 4 of a prison camp and 4 with an ankle bracelet.
Okay,
and
got out.
And everybody else was in a 0 to 6, but because I accepted a leadership role as the head of the conspiracy of these 4 people, I got the 8. So I got 4 months. Greg Anderson got 3 months, and he also got then 3 months of ankle bracelet.
How much good did the prison time do you think?
A lot of good. I got a chance.
In what respect?
Well, because, I realized that I had harmed a lot of people. And as I've said before publicly, before this, I thought I'm a big boy. If something happens, I'll accept the consequences. It is what it is. I was being reckless. And until I saw the faces of my family in tears when they came to visit me in the prison camp, and I realized all the harm and the hurt that I had done to them, I realized how unfair that was, as well as all the damage to all the athletes and their families. So I had tremendous guilt and tremendous regret about what I did. And I thought, what can I possibly do to try to call it restitution, call it whatever you want to call it, but to try to help. How can I use this knowledge that I got from being on the dark side for a couple, 3 years, whatever it was? And so that became, well, let's reach out. And I reached out to the anti-doping authorities. That was per my request. Travis Tygart wasn't even there then when Terry Madden came and met with me. And so I had these 2 meetings before he came CEO. Then when I talked to him, during this time that he did what he did to Kelly White, she never got to come back to train. He led her to believe that was how she was going to win. And then he said, okay, sorry. And I said, boy, you can't really trust this guy. So that's when I reached out to Dick Pound. I flew to New York. I met with Dick Pound. I, in addition, learned about a designer substance that was being used by cyclists, and it was being made in Austria. And I managed to have some of that substance sent directly to Dick Pound's office in New York. And he in turn took it to Christiane Ott at the Water Lab in Montreal. Then I worked with Olivier Rabin, who's the director of science for WADA, and to try to determine exactly and precisely what this was and should they put it on the prohibited substances list. But let me just tell you a little bit about my opinion of WADA, okay? And you
actually, do you want to first explain to our viewers, our listeners, WADA is the overseeing organization, then there's USADA, and then where does VADA come in your relationship with VADA? Are you able to make it a simple?
Sure.
And what should be the gold standard in your opinion? WADA, USADA, VADA,
well,
what should be the damn
not,
gold standard?
it's not WADA, and it's
WADA
not,
is the World
it's not
Anti-Doping.
USADA either. I have a completely different opinion than Jeff Nowitzki.
So it's WADA, with
WADA is
VADA
the World
underneath.
Anti-Doping Agency, and they don't actually do testing. They have the World Anti-Doping Agency code, and they give the accreditation to the about 35 laboratories around the world that do the testing. So you have to, it's very difficult. You have to be a national governing body like USADA, but every country, it's called UKAD in UK. And many of almost all the countries, like I say, there's about 35 of these labs around the country. But that's who does the testing, okay? I basically was the one who introduced Margaret Goodman to Dick Pound, the chairman of the World Anti-Doping Agency, who introduced her to Christiane Ott. And then she had to get a person to write up all the policies and procedures to meet the WADA standard, because they want to make sure you're not going to take the results and help people cheat with them. So anyway, all that got worked out there. But that's one of the things when you say, what did I do? Well, I kind of helped Margaret to get established and with credibility with Dick Pound. And then he gave us the initial doping control officers that are based in Sweden. He hooked that up. And, so there was a role that I played in the beginning. But of course, Margaret Goodman there's only one Margaret, and she deserves all the credit for VADA. So I'm certainly not trying to say that I should share in any of that. But USADA is the United States Anti-Doping Agency. And there's a long history there. And even before USADA, you had, let me to go back about WADA. And I know this has taken a lot of time, but the reason WADA was established was not to protect the health and safety of the athletes. It was all about a group called TOP, which is the Olympic Partners Program. Who's TOP? TOP is Coca-Cola, McDonald's, DuPont, on and on. Each one of these members, there were 12 members of TOP, and they had to contribute to become a member over $100 million, okay? As a part of this deal, Dick Pound was on the board of directors of the International Olympic Committee, and he was the one in charge of negotiating the sponsorship deals. So the reason that they established it was per the request of TOP, because they knew that positive drug tests were bad for business and would tarnish their logos. And that was the real reason that WADA was founded. So do I think WADA from the very beginning, and then USADA and everybody else that follows WADA, do I think that they have the best gold standard program? I do not. I believe the VADA program is better than WADA, and I can explain to you why. And of course, Nowitzki is going to argue this, and he doesn't like that I have pointed out that during camp or during the out of competition portion, there are 70 stimulants and 12 narcotics that they don't test for. So if you want to use methamphetamine, you want to use all the stimulants that you like, which help with weight cutting, which give you energy, increase muscle strength, power, speed, everything else. 100% they're performance enhancing drugs, but USADA and UFC allow these boxers to do that. Okay. I don't think that's right.
Contracted with USADA. USADA also is in charge of testing Olympic athletes from the US, correct?
Correct.
And they send out someone to test them, and those tests go to a WADA accredited lab.
Let me go back, because you asked me before, about back before USADA was founded. I know of a lot of positive drug test cover-ups. So there's a lot of corruption within the United States. Originally, the Olympic Committee, and then that turned into USADA. But there was a lot of shady things that went on. And so what happened was, and after I went to the Olympics in '88, and I met a Japanese gentleman who was a part of, it was USA Track and Field. It used to be TAC, called the Athletic Congress. And so in 1992, I went to the Olympic trials in New Orleans for track and field. And a few days afterwards, he called me up and said, "Victor, listen, I've got to tell you that there were 5 positive drug tests at the U.S. trials for the Olympics, and your guy, Greg, a shot putter, tested positive." I said, "Oh my God, wait till Greg hears this," and his wife, Mary, and and then I told him, and he said, "Oh my God, I'm going to have to get a job now. My wife is going to kill me," etc. Well, a couple of days later, he calls me back and he said, "Well, listen, there were 5 of these elder statesmen at TAC or USATF, and they got together. One of the elder statesmen passed away, and they got together, and these 5 gentlemen decided that it was just not a good time to have these positive drug tests come out. So tell your boys off the hook, they're going to be covered up." Boy, once I learned directly from an Olympic official that they were covering up positive drug tests within the United States movement, that changed my opinion of everything. Now, it took a number of years until I met Patrick Arnold that said, "I've got something that's undetectable," and it was also not illegal at the time. But, I began to distrust what goes on within the United States Olympic movement.
So the difference between USADA and VADA is several things.
Okay, so USADA does not test for stimulants and narcotics out of competition. It's just green light, do all you like. They
Out of
also
competition is anything prior to the day before your fight.
Correct. So I don't think that's right. I really don't. And then Nowitzki says, "Oh, well, the scientists at WADA believe that it's okay and that they don't do that much when
Yeah, but we can also say
died using stimulants."
This same thing just happened with the WBC
with
and its
Valdez.
president Mauricio Suleiman saying against VADA's protocols, "Oh, the substance that Oscar Valdez tested positive for is not actually a performance enhancing drug according to WADA." But WBC doesn't utilize WADA, they use VADA. That's the program that they use. And so it's even happening. It's very sad because the cover up is happening within boxing, within an organization that is supposed to be contracting VADA, the Voluntary Anti-Doping Association, for its strict guidelines of not having any out of competition banned substances. Everything is on the table. You don't get any pass for testing in competition or out of competition.
You are absolutely correct. It is just no ifs, ands, or buts. It's a performance enhancing drug. Everyone that any
What was it he
scientific
tested for again? Do you remember the name?
Phentermine, I think.
Fentramine.
Which
The
allows
reason I know
you
phentermine
to
is-
train harder, train longer, cut weight. How in the hell would that not be performance enhancing if one fighter can do all of those things leading up to a fight, the other fighter can't? It's complete. I mean, Mauricio's my friend, but that's messed up.
So let me put the ball back in Jeff Nowitzki's court. He's saying that it's okay to do that. Do you understand that?
Yes,
Everything you
because
just presented, he's
according
saying,
to
"Oh, duh, well, the WADA's
WADA's
saying this, yeah, it's okay." You know why those are not on the list? Because they would create more positive tests, which would be bad for business, and the sponsors of the Olympic Games are not going to be happy. There's the reason. It's about this.
And
It's about this. Okay.
And that was the same thing, I think, for this fight with
Nowitzki has
Oscar
said from day
Valdez.
number one, he's about this.
But I think same can be said for the WBC with this recent instance. It happened fight week, and they didn't want to call off the main event of a fight that had been percolating and
Let
hearing
me
about.
further differentiate here that one of the things that I did with Dick Pound that I knew, and people don't need to
And
know
who is
this.
Dick Pound again?
Dick Pound is the founding chairman of the World Anti-Doping Agency. He started it in 1999. He is the godfather of anti-doping, not Travis Tygart. Okay. So I went to the granddaddy.
You got to get a this has to be a Netflix
puppy.
series, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, so anyway, so what were we saying now?
But I just want to hold it before we go to Lee, because I want to pick up on one thing, and I just because you don't hold back. Do you think PED abuse is far more blatant in MMA than in boxing?
Yes, I do. I do. And here's the reason why. And you ask about the difference. And Margaret, right at the top of the enrollment form, has a statement that says, we test for all prohibited substances, which means performance enhancing drugs, at all times. Okay, now isn't that congruent that if it enhances performance on fight night, that it would also enhance performance on non-fight night? So what enables them to say, oh, well, you can enhance your performance over here, but you can't over here? So when you get a training load by using these drugs over time, you can do more repetitions, longer training to exhaustion, all these other factors, more power, more speed, et cetera, quicker reaction time. You don't think that helps you in your preparation in the training camp?
I would argue that
your performance every day instead of just on fight night. So he and I completely disagree on this. And the other thing that I wanted to explain, and this is really critically important for people to understand, after BALCO, which we were using designer substances that were undetectable, everybody kept saying, oh, well, they'll just create another designer. They'll create another designer. What's the next designer going to be? They're going to be playing catch up, and they're never going to be able to find the next designer. Well, guess what? After BALCO, there are no more designers. And there's very good reason. I'm going to tell you what it is. It used to be two-pronged, the rules of anti-doping in the anabolic steroid category. The first rule is it's similar in structure to testosterone. The second prong is that there's scientific evidence that proves that it promotes muscle growth or protein synthesis and enhances performance. So they knew that for THG, this was a brand new undetectable drug they'd never seen before. So the way to be able to come after BALCO and me and all the athletes was change the rules. So they changed the goalpost, and the second prong, they removed it. So you didn't need any science. So you have something called, all designer steroids are similar in structure to testosterone. You have what they call a mass spectrogram fragmentation pattern with various peaks. You've probably seen them. And as long as these match in a few areas, then it's similar in structure. So no matter what you do, they don't even need to know the name. It doesn't have to have any research. Bam, you're positive. So what did athletes do when all of a sudden they took away all the potential for modified or altered or derivative steroids? They moved back old school, and they use endogenous hormones, testosterone, EPO, growth hormone that your body makes. Okay.
Yes.
So it's
I remember
to differentiate between your body makes testosterone out of cholesterol, and they make synthetic out of yams. So you have a certain test called carbon isotope ratio. Now they call it IRMS. And for that test, you can differentiate between the two. So if they're microdosing, they're using creams and gels and fast acting forms of testosterone. And here's the primary reason. With that test, the IRMS test, okay, the positivity rate is 5%. All other tests are about 1%. So if you have a test that's catching 5 times more people than every other test, don't you think you ought to use it? So Margaret decided that she would use this test because she understood what I'm telling you now about the how rampant the use of synthetic testosterone is. So every single urine sample that she collects, she does this test. Now, USADA and UFC don't do that. Here's what they do. They use a TE ratio, which is really easy to circumvent. And if and only if they get a positive test for a TE ratio as a confirmatory test, then they do carbon isotope ratio or this IRMS. So she's using it 100% of the time. They're using it 5% of the time.
All right.
So there's a massive loophole there.
Now, let me counter with that. VADA is only within the WBC. Only WBC fighters have to subscribe to VADA, and not even all their fighters. It's just their ranked fighters have to use it. And the amount of testing that they get, because we've talked to Margaret, she's honest about it. They don't have the resources to test all that often. I understand what you say about which drugs that they don't allow any drugs, and they have a better testing system, you're saying, but the UFC is out there, I think, has more resources to actually go out and do more tests. I mean, you see UFC fighters, and UFC is different than MMA. You can't say, is there more doping in MMA? UFC has its own system. MMA is different. Boxing has WBC and all the other belts out there, and some boxers don't even subscribe to it. Whereas if you're in the UFC, you're subjected to it. So I don't think it's accurate to say that there's more doping in MMA than in boxing, because they're just not subjected to the same amount of regulation.
I agree. I agree.
Thanks.
Definitely boxing needs more funding, 100%. But what I also want you to understand is, in the beginning, when VADA was first formed, the first fighters that went into VADA were my fighters. And the first two in the beginning were Nonito Donaire and Edwin Rodriguez. And they did 24/7, 365 testing. And I'm the one that sponsored both of them and paid for the testing. So when Nowitzki says, well, what does he do? He doesn't deserve a place at the table. There's many, many things that I just told you that I've done.
You require, if you're going to sponsor a fighter, you require that they are enrolled in.
I have sponsored many fighters.
You know what?
And you require
I gotta move it along. I gotta move it along, Am. What I've always wondered, and I call fights all over the world. And I often wondered, when these fighters are coming out to the ring, even for the fights I did last week in California, what percentage of boxers are tested for anything on just club shows but televised shows, but not world champion. I mean, what percentage of fighters, Victor, are even being tested for any damn thing?
There obviously needs to be much more. I don't think anybody is going to dispute that. And it needs to be 24/7, 365. And that's what I've been pushing for from day number one. And there are some, I believe that Canelo's now doing 24/7, 365. And, she's right about the fact that all the UFC fighters, now that's not all MMA fighters, because you have other organizations as well, but they have the lion's share of these fighters. So you've got, the front door, the back door, and the side door. And what I'm saying is the back door is wide open. Now, do I believe that the best program that would be likely, the VADA program with 24/7, 365 would be better than USADA. But your argument about, well, they've captured them, they have to do what they do, so they have a door open, they get to use all the stimulants they like, where VADA doesn't do that. But if you notice the name, it's voluntary as opposed to what the UFC is doing. And I'll go back to this issue of, I don't know this, but I'd be willing to bet that Margaret does this for the health and safety of the athletes, and she's not making a $500,000, $600,000 salary like Nowitzki is and like Tygart is. She's doing it for the right reasons.
Yeah.
Okay?
All right. Well, if I don't go to poor Lee Grove soon, he's going to wander out there to the streets of friendly West Virginia. All right, Lee, go ahead.
There aren't too many streets in friendly either. So given what happened at BALCO, and given all of the fallout that happened after that, one would have thought that was the end of Victor Conte. But here you are, you created SNAC, and you have Nonito Donaire, and you have Devin Haney, and you're back in the game. How were you able to recover your reputation enough to gain the trust of these athletes? And what was the process like for you to get your name back?
Well, I'm in the trenches with them. I train with them. I'm at the beach. I'm on the track. I'm in the gym. I work with them and their teams closely. They know me. So in the beginning, Nonito was the first one, and he basically, there was all sorts of criticism, like, why are you working with him and blah, 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 blah. And he said, listen, Vada's got a needle, I've got a vein, and you can test me anytime. And so there you go. I'm willing to subject myself to stringent testing, and then another one and another one and another one. And I just kept, introducing all of my athletes to Vada and to Margaret. And I would say there's probably over the last decade, more than 20 world champions that I work with that have enrolled in Vada. So I'm trying to, in my own way, use the knowledge that I gained on the dark side to help them to catch the people. So I've switched sides, and thank you to Mr. Nowitzki for bringing me over to the right side. Like I said, I became disillusioned when I discovered that there was all sorts of positive drug test cover-ups, and there's so many things I could tell you that about the laboratory, and people that they work with. I actually, during that time frame when we were doing the illegal stuff with BALCO, I hired the guy who was the assistant to Don Catlin at the UCLA Olympic Analytical Testing Laboratory, and he was giving me information of what was going on inside the laboratory. So I realized, are there people within the Olympic network that are accepting for money urine samples from agents and stuff? And I gave this information to Dick Pound, and they would go to the lab at night, female in Budapest, Hungary. There was a specific lady that I identified there who would test the samples in advance and come back to the agents and say, oh, it's still there. She can't compete in the world championships because she's going to get a positive drug test. So the actual testers themselves were aiding and abetting these athletes who were using drugs. So these are things that it's the culture is it corrupt? Do I believe from top to bottom? Do I think that WADA has a genuine interest in catching these athletes? I don't think they do.
And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, there's a woman testing positive for marijuana and isn't allowed to run in the Olympics. And
I don't know if you saw the article that I wrote, but I talked about that, and it was on a website called Sportico. But yeah, it's I can tell you other things that, to give you an example. Let me sum it up this way.
Do you feel, if for those that didn't read the article, in just a few words, do you think she should have been allowed to run?
Yes.
Me too. But I do gummies. I do the medical marijuana gummies every night, so I'm obviously in her corner.
So let me tell you what happened.
You could probably utilize some of that blood work that you're doing, some blood work analysis.
Yeah.
I want to tell you something that happened with my meeting with Dick Pound when I went to New York and met with him, and they had an attorney there that was scribing everything for 3.5 hours. And I gave him all this information that I knew would be very helpful. And he had served 8 years, and he stepped down at the beginning of 2008, right before the Olympics in Beijing. And he said about our meeting, listen, this guy has a lot of information. I know everybody thinks he's a bad guy, but this guy can be helpful, and they need to listen to this bad guy. The new incoming president was John Fahey from Australia. And he said, listen, I choose to get my information from medical doctors, not from convicted felons. So they didn't want to have much to do with me. So later in 2010, when I got this, it was called AMTH2. It was an injectable designer substance that I got sent to Dick, who went to the et cetera, et cetera. So 3 years later, I went back to Dick and I said, Dick, now that I've actually produced a substance from you from the dark side that's being used all over the place by cyclists, 25 track and field athletes, et cetera, what I would like you to do is go back and get the minutes from our meeting, because I watched the guy transcribe, and tell me why they haven't acted on any of the information that I gave to them. He said, okay, I'll call you back and I'll talk to him. A couple days later, he calls back and he said, Victor, I'm sorry to report to you, but I've been told that the minutes to our meeting have been destroyed.
Lee, keep going. Ask a couple
Yeah,
more
don't
questions.
let me interrupt because I'll just
It's
take
okay.
over.
It's okay. You obviously you have a lot of knowledge about nutritional supplements and recovery methods, and you know how they can be applied legally as well as illegally. You talk about being on the dark side. Now you're on the other side. When you created Snack more than a decade ago, I'm sure that you've had clients be involved in very high stakes fights. Have you ever been tempted to go back to the bad old days to give your clients that edge to guarantee that they would emerge victorious in those big fights?
No.
And why? How do you handle it? And what's your story there?
Have there been people that have come and approached me and asked me to do that? There have. They come initially and they hint around and they talk in general terms, and and I had one, I don't want to say the name, but a world champion boxer who called me up and said, listen, I have this guy that wants to come and talk to you. He's my good friend. He was in my wedding, et cetera, et cetera. And then he came with a couple other guys and we went to lunch. And then he came back and told the other guys to get out of the car. And then he said, well, now I'm going to tell you why I'm really here. I want you to give my fighter drugs. And we know you know how to do it, et cetera, et cetera. And we're willing to pay you a lot of money. I said, you've got the wrong guy. I cannot help you. And of course, I called his head trainer at the time and told him, listen, I can't have anything to do with this guy ever again because he's looking to go down the dark side. And I wouldn't do it mainly for my family. But another reason is I have built an institution. I have created a product that has sold over $300 million. More than $50 million has come to me personally. So I'm not going to lose that business or that reputation. I've got too much to lose now.
Yeah.
And so
It's miraculous.
It sense
It's
to me.
miraculous.
Why, if you were young and you're hungry and you're trying to build your way up, but I'm already there. I've got mine. So I'm trying to protect what I've built over the last decade.
In this corner of the podcast on Fight TV with sports nutritionist, the Snack founder and chief executive, Victor Conte. But that leads a few more minutes here. I want to ask you this, hypothetically, so you have Devin Haney, Caleb Plant, Nonito Donaire. Let's just, my dear friend Nonito, let's stick with him. So if you have Nonito, the guy that you've worked with, who's a world champion again, despite his age, you've done a great job, and he certainly speaks so highly of you. If there was this Nonito, but then you could go back and you could work with him with BALCO and be the bad Victor Conte, and you work that athlete against this athlete, who would win?
No question, the athlete on PEDs.
Why?
Because they're more powerful than what you can do naturally. So I would say if I had to put a percent to it, what we were doing with BALCO toward what we're doing with Snack now, I would say maybe we're 25% as effective. So we can definitely help them. But if you think you can, replace undetectable steroids and EPO, growth hormone, insulin, thyroid, and a whole array of 8 or 9 different drugs, you can't. So we do give them a competitive edge. They do. And I'll tell you what people need to understand, and I'll give you an analogy here, is performance enhancement is about, at this point, is about the recovery interval. And Michael Johnson, a 400-meter gold medalist, produced a film that's out now called Chasing Perfection. And if you haven't seen it, I suggest you watch it, because that's what I'm doing. I'm bringing the recovery stuff. We're using low oxygen, we're using high oxygen, we're using all sorts of chambers and domes and other, and here's the example. Imagine if I'll use a race car analogy. You got a race car going around the track and they got to come in for a pit stop. So you imagine that's the recovery interval. And you've got a guy that runs out and he sticks his gas can in one spout, and it's going to take 20 seconds for him to put the gas in, and the guy goes back out. Well, now imagine if you developed a car with 2 spouts coming out of the gas tank, and you got 2 guys running out there, and you can put that gas in half the amount of time. So it only takes 10 seconds instead of 20 seconds. He goes out and he's 10 seconds ahead. So this is what I've done is focused on, and I have a team of doctors and therapists and trainers and coaches. It's not just me, it's an entire, when I talked before about a project team leader. So when a fighter comes, whatever, we fill in the gaps with the people that are a part of our team, but sometimes they have their own people, sometimes they don't. So we put this all together, and they call it Conte University, or because we have a schedule here, we have a team here, we're the professors, they're the students. You know, you can imagine these guys show up in Rolls Royces and Ferraris and entourages and all this, and we don't let them in. I mean, we'll say, okay, what are you? "Oh, I'm the barber." Okay, you go wait in the parking lot. You know, it's a very tightly run ship, and they abide by our rules and do what we do because they're not paying me. I'm sponsoring them. So
I got you. Here's something really important. When I got into this and used to have John Listini on, and I ended up later on having Mike Webster from the Steelers on, and you think about what was the typical steroid-looking athlete like a Lee Haney or a Lou Ferrigno, or with the females with the voices and the obvious, and then comes CTE. Is there a direct correlation between PEDs or the old steroids and CTE, or do you think that PEDs, steroids, can exacerbate CTE?
exactly, yes, they can. There's no question when you increase the speed and power of these punches, it's going to cause additional damage.
But
So-
anything
so-
within the actual drugs themselves that could do that, and I know you're not, it's maybe an
You mean
unfair
from
question.
taking the drugs, from taking
Yeah.
the drugs?
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a question for Margaret. Or I don't know.
Probably is a question for Margaret, you know. I
Yeah.
mean, in terms of the damage, no question.
Because that's a real
Okay.
concern of mine. You know, Victor, I'm lucky enough, blessed enough to host the International Boxing Hall of Fame each year. And, you know, even now I'm on a big crusade against these people like Evander Holyfield fighting, James Toney fighting, Riddick Bowe fighting, people that, in my opinion, already have some form of brain damage going back, whether it be a celebrity match or any kind of match. I just don't think these old dudes, need to be getting hit in the head. So that's just something I try to find a way to squeeze in on every program.
I could not agree more.
Yeah. So any final questions, Amber?
I have one last question, and it pertains to the Canelo camp, and Oscar Valdez is part of the Canelo camp, at least under trainer Eddie Reynosa. Canelo tested positive a couple years back, and he claimed it was contaminated meat. Do you think there is an issue within that camp of potential PED use? And what do you make of that contaminated meat argument?
Okay. I did some interviews back at the time, one for ESPN, and I was very critical of Canelo. But at that time, what I suggested that they do was to do a hair test. And I actually talked to the director of the lab, the WADA accredited lab in Utah, where Margaret sends the samples, the same place that USADA sends them for UFC fighters. And I knew that they were already using hair samples from racehorses for clenbuterol. And they had this was a valid method, and actually to the point scientifically where 5 or 6 racehorses had been suspended. So when Canelo stepped up and he said, "I'm willing to do a hair test." Now imagine a hair test is like, it's a more long-term perspective, historical. Urine is the acute here and now dynamic, but hair gives you the longer perspective. So if a guy is willing to step up and give you a hair sample, that is very significant. He did so, and it came back consistent with the use of consuming contaminated meat. Now, let's talk about that for a minute.
Now it was
They did a
red hair, right?
survey.
It was red. It was the red hair of Canelo, right?
Well,
Uh-huh.
some say that lighter hair, that clenbuterol has an affinity for darker hair.
I didn't even
et
know
cetera,
that.
et cetera.
I was trying to be humorous.
I know, but what I'm saying is way back, something like 2011, 5 Mexico soccer players tested positive for clenbuterol, and they went back and they looked, and it came out, and it's like they determined from these slaughterhouses in Mexico that when you walk up to a hamburger stand or walk into a restaurant, 1 out of 3 shot, you're going to get a clenbuterol contaminated meat that's going to cause a positive test. So is that a valid argument? Now, later they made him go back, go to the restaurant, get the receipts, get from the restaurant, trace those receipts back to the slaughterhouse, all this. So there was traceability there. So to mitigate the punishment that he got, he did everything you could ask him to do. So I changed my mind later. I was less critical and suspicious after he stepped up and gave that hair sample. Now, that's Canelo, okay? Now, when you move on to Valdez, as we know, you have what they call strict liability rule number 10. You're responsible for what's in your body, no matter how it got there. So when you have phentermine, which is not in contaminated meat, it's not in supplements. There's never been a supplement, an herbal tea, anything else that's ever had phentermine in it before. I personally used to give phentermine to NFL players. So I've worked with it, I've distributed it, I've been around the athletes that have used it. I can tell you it's a very powerful central nervous system stimulant. It's from the amphetamine family. You all know the history of amphetamines or greenies in Major League Baseball. Almost everybody in the sport, including Willie Mays and Hank Aaron and everybody else, is admitted to doing this. Does it enhance performance? 100% it does. So anybody's like Nowitzki saying, oh, no, listen to WADA. Oh, yeah, don't look over there because that's where our cash cow game is, Be careful and be cautious because there's much more that one day will come out. If you'd like to do it now, I'll tell you about Nowitzki. But there's some stuff there.
Amber and I want
just be cautious about what he says and what he does, because I know some things that he's done that were really not on the up and up. And it caused an internal federal investigation of him, at which time he admitted to all this stuff. So
I don't even know. I don't know. I don't even know the dude. Yeah, I don't even know the dude. But I want some free advice on a couple of things. My use of something and Amber's use of something. So my use of something would be deer antler that I use under my tongue. I've used for 20 years, and Amber's a big fan of horny goat weed. Those two things.
Well, they both have some type of positive effect. You remember when Ray Lewis, the football player, took it it caused him to test positive in the NFL? It was around the Super Bowl time, if I remember correctly.
Which was it, horny goat weed or?
No, deer antler.
Deer antler.
Deer antler has been around for thousands of years, used in Chinese medicine. That's not anything new. They tell anybody that's in a competitive sport where there's testing to don't use that because it would cause a positive test. But how significant are the effects? I think that of course it depends on dosage.
Well, look at me, Victor. Look at me. I'm 62.
You look like a fountain of youth. Look. I mean, you're ready to go. I think you're going to come back and maybe reconsider another shot at boxing.
Not unless you have something that could make me significantly taller and heavier. Because there's only one fight I'd want. It would be Jake Paul, just for the money, but he's still too damn big for me. But listen, we have to give you a lot of credit though for what you're doing these days. A lot of good things with a lot of great athletes, including my dear friend Nonito Donaire. I appreciate your candor. One final thing I always ask pretty much everybody: how do you want to be remembered as a sports nutritionalist and as a man?
I guess I could sum it up as saying I would like to be remembered as somebody who gave more than he took. My intention is to help these athletes. None of these athletes have ever paid me money. I was fortunate enough to create a product, and I have 140 distributors all around the world. And this is kind of a hobby to me. This is a kind of a trying to make things right period for me. I'm not doing it for money, and any of these athletes will tell you. And that's a very good question too, is why do they trust me? These are multi-million-dollar athletes, and I've got this history, and it's not just one, but 20 world champions have come to me, and they come back to me, and I've been with these people, some of them for 10 years or longer. So success leaves clues. I think I've done some things right. I will always have the haters out there that will never ever forgive me, and I understand that. And there's something to be said for that. You know, once a cheater, always a cheater. But I believe that there is such a thing as second chances. And I like the fact that I'm becoming an example of that. I'm not there yet, but I'm trying to show people that when you make bad mistakes, that you can come back and you can make a contribution to society.
Well, I thank you for what you're doing with the sport of boxing. Heaven knows it. Everything in boxing is backwards and needs the help. And for what you're doing with the fighters, and we'll definitely call upon you when we need some expertise on this subject, because it ain't going away.
Thank you for the great questions too. I really appreciate it.
Thank
Victor
you.
Conte, everybody. We'll come back and break down AJ and Usyk right after this.